can you believe that the city you think you know, the polished icon of global finance, was born not just once, but has been murdered and resurrected over 20 times? This is not just history. It is a ghost story whispered over 2 millennia. The saga of a metropolis built on marsh gas, Roman blood, Viking steel, and ashes so deep they still choke the modern tube lines today. We are about to dive into the monstrous, impossible timeline of London, a city that was never supposed to exist, a place that defied geography, defied empires, and defied oblivion itself, time and time again. Forget what you think you know about sleepy documentaries. This is the truth of the Inferno. Before the legions, before the fog was stained with coal smoke, before Big Ben ever tolled, there was only a desperate, waterlogged patch of land beside a wild, untamed river, the Thames. It was a place where the tides fought the current, where dense, primeval forests reached down to the water's edge, and where ancient tribes knew better than to try and tame the swirling mud and the endless rain. Then came the roar of Rome. In 43 AD, the colossal ego of Emperor Claudius demanded a foothold, a place to launch the subjugation of the entire terrifying island of Britannia. He didn't just send soldiers, he sent the crushing weight of global civilization, an army designed to erase everything that came before it. They saw the narrowest point of the Thames, where the low tide made the crossing possible, and they declared this miserable, swampy spot the center of their new universe. They called it Londinium, and it exploded into existence. Within a generation, Londinium was a thriving, vulgar frontier town, a magnet for traders, financiers, and the desperate seeking their fortune. Timber buildings rose shoulder to shoulder, packed tight against the rising damp, smelling of fish, spice, and fear. It was a testament to Roman ambition, a beacon of order in the chaos. But that order was a thin, fragile veneer, stretched over a furious, pulsing resentment that was about to shatter the foundation of everything. They had humiliated the Iceni queen, Boudica. They had scourged her daughters and seized her kingdom. And in that moment, Rome didn't just create an enemy. They unleashed an apocalyptic force of nature upon their own fledgling capital. The year is 60 AD. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was far away, busy fighting campaigns in Wales, completely oblivious to the tidal wave of vengeance gathering behind him. Boudica, a figure of mythic terror, a woman with hair of fire and eyes of ice, rallied tens of thousands of warriors. They were not an army. They were a hurricane fueled by righteous, savage hatred. Their target was obvious, the heart of the Roman insult, the shimmering, ambitious city of Londinium. Paulinus received the chilling intelligence too late. He knew the force descending was too vast, too frenzied, for his meager garrison to hold. In a brutal, pragmatic decision that cemented London's destiny of endless destruction, he abandoned the city. He marched his soldiers out, leaving the thousands of Roman citizens, traders, and their families to their fate. Imagine the moment of pure, blinding terror, watching the disciplined legions turn their backs and march away, knowing that beyond the gates, the war cries were growing louder, closer. They had been promised protection by the empire. They were left to be devoured by the fire. Boudicca's forces arrived, a screaming, unstoppable torrent. This was not a siege. It was an execution. Londinium was systematically leveled. Every timber structure, every market stall, every hastily built Roman bath was put to the torch. The fire that consumed the city was so immense, so hot, and so thoroughly engineered to erase all evidence of Roman life that the layers of ash and scorched earth remain visible to archaeologists almost 2,000 years later. It became known as the Boudiccan destruction layer, a thick red stain of pulverized tile and charcoal that marks the official end of London's first life. The city was not simply defeated, it was annihilated, wiped from the map. But here is the impossible truth, the great, terrifying secret of London. Within a few short years, the Romans returned. They didn't just rebuild, they rebuilt better, stronger, and with stone, determined that no force of fire or fury would ever erase their presence again. They excavated the ashes of their dead, drew new plans, and began the brutal, necessary work of hauling this impossible city back from the grave. This initial act of ultimate violence and subsequent defiant rebirth established the DNA of the capital. Every plague, every foreign invasion, every catastrophic fire, every blitzkrieg would follow this terrifying pattern. London dies. London resurrects. This is where our journey truly begins. We are going to close our eyes and drift through the smoky ruins of the greatest city in the world, tracking the relentless, violent forces that tried to kill it, from the moment Claudius first set foot on the hostile shore, to the endless, modern megalopolis that stands today. Get ready, because the river of time is deep, dark, and full of ghosts. We start now, sinking into the mud and the madness of Londinium's first fiery demise. The date is 47 AD. The mighty Roman Empire, under the iron fist of Emperor Claudius, had barely finished conquering the wild southern tribes. But their ambitions were already charting a new future in the cold northern mud. They found the perfect spot, a slight rise of land next to a river bend, where the swirling Thames could be bridged, and yet still welcome ships loaded with Mediterranean wine and African grain. This was not a military fort, carved out of stone and fear. This was a logistical miracle, a trading post designed for one thing only: absolute, unchecked profit. The name they gave it was simple, functional, and utterly devoid of history. Londinium. It was a reckless, sprawling boom town, built quickly with timber and wattle and daub, a place where fortunes were made and lost faster than the tides, attracting merchants, slaves, and opportunists from every corner of the known world. The population surged, driven by the seductive promise of wealth, turning the river crossing into a chaotic, vibrant nexus of global trade within just a few years. But this new order was built upon a fault line of betrayal and unimaginable suffering. The Romans, masters of administration, were also masters of cruelty, especially toward those they deemed barbarians, and one tribe, the Iceni, had been pushed too far past the point of no return. Their king, Prasutagus, died believing he had secured his kingdom by leaving half his wealth to Rome. A fatal, tragic miscalculation that cost the Iceni everything. The moment he breathed his last, the legions swept in, seizing every asset, dissolving the tribe's identity, and systematically humiliating its leaders with sickening glee. And Boudica, already a towering figure of Celtic defiance, now transformed into an avenging spirit, a whirlwind of red hair and righteous fury, calling every disgruntled tribe, every humiliated family, and every landless warrior to her banner. She promised them not just victory, but the total eradication of the Roman stain, burning the very ground they walked on. The governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was campaigning deep in Wales, preoccupied with destroying Druids on the sacred island of Mona, completely oblivious to the existential threat sweeping toward the heart of his new province, Britannia. When the news finally reached him, it was a terrifying whisper of smoke and speed. Boudica was marching south with a horde estimated by later historians at 100,000 screaming, vengeful warriors, and Londinium was directly in her path, undefended and hopelessly doomed. Paulinus raced back, desperately trying to save the heart of Roman Britain. But when he arrived at the bustling trade hub, he was faced with an impossible, life or death choice. He commanded maybe 4,000 disciplined troops, far too few to hold the wide, sprawling wooden city against the sheer magnitude of the rebellion. A desperate fight he knew he could not win. To stay meant certain, humiliating death for his entire fighting force, the loss of the entire province, and maybe his own head on a pike. The cold, brutal calculus of Roman command forced him to make a decision that sealed the horrifying fate of every remaining resident. He ordered an immediate, total evacuation of the military forces and anyone able to flee under their protection. He left the rest, the elderly, the sick, the slaves, the majority of the civilian population who could not keep pace, to the mercy of a goddess of war they had personally created and inflamed. Imagine the sheer, raw terror of that moment, the organized clamor of the soldiers packing up, the desperate pleas of the civilians who had built their lives here, realizing they were being abandoned to the slaughter waiting just beyond the bridge. The gates swung open, not to welcome the Queen with a diplomatic surrender, but to usher in a horrifying, systematic slaughter that would define the city's infancy. Boudica's forces did not just defeat the population, they sought purification through absolute annihilation, a blood sacrifice to avenge their queen's dishonor and cleanse the land of foreign influence.
Every single structure, from the lavish merchant houses to the cramped taverns and government offices, was systematically looted, smashed, and then set ablaze in a conflagration so hot, so complete, that the very mud beneath the wooden streets was baked into hard, brittle, reddish clay. Archaeologists working thousands of years later uncovered what is now known simply as the Boudican destruction layer, a thick, unmistakable band of ash, melted pottery, and charred debris that stretches uniformly across the entire footprint of the early city.
This layer is chilling evidence of the fire's intensity. In some places, the heat was so fierce that wooden timbers vanished instantly, leaving behind ghostly voids in the earth, and Roman bronze coins fused together into solid, unrecognizable lumps of metal, a silent testament to the Inferno's power. Londinium, the glittering new hub of commerce, had existed for less than 2 decades, and in a single day it was wiped completely off the map, leaving only smoking ruins and the echoes of terrified ghosts along the banks of the mighty Thames. The Romans had built a city of wood and profit. Boudica ensured its end was swift, dramatic, and fueled by the deepest possible hatred. It was the first time London died, but terrifyingly, it would not be the last time this stubborn settlement was swallowed whole by disaster, only to miraculously rise again. The air was thick, not just with the lingering stench of burnt timber and human loss, but with the cold, calculating fury of the Roman Empire. Nero did not weep for the lost wooden shacks. He saw an opportunity. The ashes of Boudica's rage became the perfect foundation for a new city, a city built to last, a testament to unforgiving imperial power that would crush rebellion under its concrete heel. The legions marched back into the blackened landscape, their hobnailed boots crunching over the calcified remains of the previous settlement. This time, there would be no temporary measure. This would be Londinium proper, a blueprint of stone, discipline, and uncompromising order, meticulously laid out across the muddy banks of the Thames, a defiant declaration etched into the British soil. The Romans understood that dominance wasn't just about swords, it was about infrastructure. Their first monumental challenge was bridging the monstrous tidal river, a feat of engineering that stunned the local tribes and ensured permanent military and commercial control. They didn't just build a crossing. They erected the world's most magnificent timber structure, the precursor to London Bridge, transforming the Thames from a massive barrier into an arterial highway for global trade. This bridge was the city's undisputed lifeblood, controlling the flow of goods, wealth, and military might pouring in from the European continent and into Britannia's wild, unconquered interior. At the northern end of that awe-inspiring bridge, the Romans erected the ultimate status symbol, the Forum. This was more than just a massive marketplace. It was a screaming declaration of civilization, a sprawling complex of basilicas, law courts, and temples, making Londinium the undeniable administrative and economic capital, immediately overshadowing older, less strategically placed settlements. This was where the great machinery of empire whirred into motion, processing taxes, dispensing justice, and consolidating the enormous wealth generated by Britannia's mineral riches and agricultural exports. The city was reborn, not as a flimsy port, but as a glittering imperial masterpiece built on a grid plan that promised eternity. By the middle of the 2nd century AD, Londinium had utterly exploded. It wasn't just a military camp anymore. It was a vibrant, multicultural hub, boasting possibly 45,000 residents, a colossal metropolis by ancient standards, teeming with merchants from Syria, soldiers from Germany, and administrators from Rome itself, all chasing the thrill of wealth and power on the frontier. The noise was deafening, a relentless symphony of empire, the clatter of chariot wheels on paved stone, the shouting of auctioneers in multiple languages, the constant metallic din of construction as they paved new roads and erected public buildings with meticulous, unstoppable Roman care. Imagine the spectacle of daily life. Lavish public bathhouses where citizens socialized, conducted high-stakes business, and relaxed in the warm steam. Temples dedicated to Jupiter, Mars, and the exotic Persian god Mithras stood side by side, showcasing a spiritual pluralism unique to the empire's frontiers. Opulent villas decorated with stunning, vibrant mosaics and frescoes sprang up, all heated by sophisticated hypocaust systems that fought back the biting British cold. This was the pinnacle of refined Roman life, transplanted with fierce pride to the cold, damp fringes of the known world, a defiant beacon of sophisticated urbanity and absolute control. Londinium became the very definition of success, the jewel of Britannia, a city whose very existence proved that Rome's grasp was inescapable. But even success breeds paranoia, and the very height of its prosperity contained the seeds of its ultimate destruction. As the 3rd century dawned, the distant, terrifying rumblings of a failing empire began to echo even in the quiet harbors of Britannia. Barbarian incursions were intensifying along the northern frontier, and the sacred Pax Romana was fracturing under the colossal weight of its own administrative and military burden. Londinium needed protection, not just from internal dissent, but from external, terrifying threats lurking in the Germanic forests and the turbulent North Sea. And so the citizens witnessed the creation of the defining feature of the ancient city, a structure that would survive nearly all future disasters, the gigantic defensive walls. These weren't mere fences or palisades. They were massive, uncompromising fortifications, nearly 2 miles long and 20 feet high, built from heavy Kentish ragstone and creating an impenetrable shell around the entire thriving port and administrative center. These walls were a paradoxical, intimidating monument. They signified immense, unshakable strength and permanence, yet they were born of deep, existential fear. They defined London's geographic borders for the next 1,500 terrifying years, a chilling, stone-cold reminder that the city was always under siege, always waiting for the next catastrophe to crash down upon its sturdy gates. For nearly 300 years, those magnificent walls held fast, protecting the glittering jewel within, enduring minor skirmishes and political coups. But the existential threat didn't come from outside. It came from decay, at the very heart of the sprawling empire itself. Rome was failing, stretched impossibly thin by endless civil wars, devastating economic collapse, and overwhelming migratory pressures that the imperial legions could no longer contain. The orders came slowly at first, then with frightening, terrifying speed. The legions were pulling back, desperately needed to defend the core of the ancient world. The sudden departure was not a glorious, planned retreat. It was an agonizing bleed-out of essential personnel and resources. The highly organized infrastructure, so dependent on centralized imperial management, began to crumble immediately upon the legionaries' withdrawal. The centralized supply chains vanished. The sophisticated aqueducts and sewage systems stopped working. The incessant, vibrant noise of the city, once deafening, began to fade into an ominous, terrifying silence that swallowed the streets whole. The unthinkable happened. Londinium, the proud Roman capital, began to starve itself of administration, maintenance, and purpose. The wealthy elite fled back to the continent, leaving their magnificent villas to rot and decay, their valuable mosaics covered in dust and moss. The population plummeted drastically, from tens of thousands to maybe only a few hundred desperate, forgotten souls, huddling for warmth and safety behind those immense, intimidating walls, struggling to maintain a fragile, hopeless existence. By the early 5th century AD, the greatest city in Britannia entered its most terrifying phase, the Great Silence. The official Roman record stops cold. The lights went out completely. The docks lay abandoned and empty, the massive forum overgrown with tenacious weeds. Londinium didn't fall to a climactic, fiery battle like its first death under Boudica. It simply withered away, abandoned, swallowed whole by the dense forest that crept back to reclaim its territory. A ghost town, haunted by its former glory. The very name, Londinium, vanished almost completely from local memory. What exactly happened inside those gigantic walls during the next 200 years is one of history's deepest, most suspenseful mysteries, a terrifying black hole of recorded time and civilization. The city had died its second, silent death, leaving nothing but decaying stone and the terrifying promise that something new, something fierce, and something utterly unrecognizable was about to crawl out of the ruins. The stage was set for the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons and the violent, brutal birth of Londonwick. The Roman legions didn't just march away. They ripped the very soul out of the city and left behind a vacuum of unimaginable terror. The grand architecture of Londinium, that shining beacon of imperial power, was now just a collection of cold, haunted ruins, slowly being consumed by the marsh and the creeping ivy of the forgotten world. The sophisticated supply chains vanished, the rule of law disintegrated, and the great paved roads led nowhere but back into the brutal, chaotic reality of post-imperial Britain, a landscape now dominated by warring tribes. This was the moment the city died its second great death. Not in a blaze of fire like Boudicca's rage, but in a slow, agonizing slide into oblivion, a casualty of administrative neglect and cultural collapse. For nearly 200 years, the old city lay fallow, a dark, silent testament to a grandeur that was now completely incomprehensible to the few scavengers and squatters who dared to enter the massive, crumbling walls. But where one city died, another, far more rugged and savage, was already beginning to stir from the mud. The Anglo-Saxons were not interested in preserving the monumental past. They were a Germanic people, driven by trade, agriculture, and the volatile politics of tribal conquest. They abandoned the heavily fortified Roman site entirely, perhaps fearing the ghosts or simply finding the colossal walls too large and ominous for their decentralized structure, shifting their focus slightly west. This new, muddy, utterly decentralized trading port was called Londonwick. It sprang up roughly where modern Covent Garden and Aldwych now stand, built entirely of wood and thatch. A sprawling, temporary-looking place lacking the stone glamour of its Roman predecessor, but brimming with the raw, volatile energy of commerce. Londonwick wasn't a capital. It was a contested prize, a high-value pawn constantly shifting between the powerful, jealous kingdoms of the Heptarchy. It was a trade gateway, a crucial artery for the flow of wealth, and therefore a constant target in the deadly game played by the ferocious kings of Mercia and the rising power of Wessex, constantly changing hands like a hot iron. Despite the chaos, the city managed to grow into a substantial settlement, a hub where goods from the continent, wine, luxury fabrics, and tools were exchanged for English slaves, wool, and metalwork. It was a tough, lawless existence, governed more by the demands of the market than by any consistent royal decree. Then came the unexpected spiritual invasion, which sought to conquer not territory, but the very souls of the fierce Saxons. In 604 AD, the missionary Mellitus arrived, sent by Rome to reclaim the spiritual ground that the legions had failed to keep, attempting to convert the East Saxons. He established the first iteration of St. Paul's Cathedral,
a modest structure that would become the spiritual anchor of a nation still struggling to find its political feet, even though the Saxons temporarily drove him out, preferring their pagan gods. This injection of faith gave Londonwick a brief, fragile respite, a spiritual purpose that transcended the squabbling of warlords. For a time, Londonwick flourished, establishing itself as a sophisticated market town, famous across the continent for its thriving river trade and bustling craftspeople, particularly under the relatively stable grip of Mercian overlords. But stability is a phantom in the history of London. Just as this fragile new civilization started to feel secure, just as the wood and thatch roofs began to feel like permanent homes, and the churches began to hold real power, the horizon darkened with the unmistakable, soul-chilling shadow of the dragon ship. The terror had returned, but this time it spoke Norse. The 9th century dawned with an apocalyptic sound, the rhythmic, unstoppable chopping of oars against the tidal flow of the Thames. The Vikings, the Danes, the Norsemen, the great heathen army, were not invaders seeking gentle land to farm. They were professional destroyers seeking unimaginable, concentrated riches. London, sitting plump and wealthy on the Thames, was a beacon for their insatiable greed and their terrifying military efficiency. The first raids were surgical strikes of pure devastation, shattering the economy and scattering the populace like terrified mice, leaving behind only smoking ruins and bloody memories. Londonwick was sacked, burned, and occupied repeatedly. The sheer volume of attacks demonstrated that controlling the Thames was paramount to controlling the island's wealth, and the Vikings knew it. By 871 AD, the invaders had done the unthinkable. They had established a permanent winter camp within the city's ruins, effectively taking complete control of the region. London was now Lundensister, a bloody, coveted trophy in the hands of the ferocious Danes, used as a base for further conquest deep into England. The dream of a unified Anglo-Saxon England seemed to be dying right there on the banks of the polluted, blood-soaked Thames, choked by the longships. Just when all hope seemed extinguished, when the remaining Saxons were reduced to hiding in the marshes and praying for salvation, a single decisive figure emerged from the smoke and mud. Alfred, King of Wessex, the one man capable of forging a nation out of shattered, exhausted kingdoms. Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great, was a genius strategist. He understood that simply defeating the Vikings in open battle was not enough. He had to secure the strategic heart of the island, and that heart was London. He recognized that its ancient walls and river access were the key to national defense. He didn't just rebuild the sprawling, vulnerable Londonwick. He moved the entire population and its commerce back into the immense, massive, still-standing Roman walls of the old Londinium. This act was pure genius. It was a strategic retreat into history, consolidating a vast, sprawling town into a tight, defensible fortress. This fortified, centralized city
became the cornerstone of his revolutionary defensive network, the Burgold-Hittite, a system of well-garrisoned towns designed to repel the next inevitable Viking attack. London was reborn yet again, not as a vulnerable market town, but as a strategic military powerhouse, ready to face the long, bitter wars that would eventually decide the true ruler of England.
Alfred rebuilt the walls, established a firm civic government, and issued new laws, setting London on an irreversible path to becoming the fixed political and commercial center it was destined to be. The city had endured the ultimate collapse, survived the terrifying raids, and was now a hard, shining diamond, forged by fire and Viking steel. The stage was now perfectly set for the ultimate showdown, the fight between Saxon dynasty and Norse ambition for the crown itself.
The air was thick, not with river fog, but with the suffocating dread of an empty throne. After decades of uneasy peace, forged in the ashes of the Viking Wars, the ultimate question mark hung over London. Who would wear the crown of England? Edward the Confessor, the last of the powerful Wessex line, had finally drawn his last breath, leaving behind a kingdom balanced on the razor's edge of civil war and foreign invasion. The Witena Gaemot, the great council of wise men and bishops, met within the stone halls of Westminster, the site of Edward's magnificent new abbey, desperately trying to select a successor before the inevitable storm broke upon the coast. They knew that London was the prize, the ultimate symbol of legitimacy that every ambitious warlord in Europe coveted. Their choice, driven by necessity and ambition, fell upon Harold Godwinson, the mighty Earl of Wessex, a man who had proved his mettle in battle and diplomacy, but whose claim was immediately tainted by the oath he may or may not have sworn to a far more terrifying contender. This was the moment of impossible speed, the desperate race against fate, because two armies, two tidal waves of destiny, were already launching their fleets toward the vulnerable island. To the north came the hammer of the Norse gods, Harald Hardrada, the terrifying Viking king of Norway, claiming the throne through ancient pacts and raw, brutal power. He was a veteran of countless battles, a man whose reputation alone caused lesser kings to surrender, and he saw England as the last great jewel in the Viking crown. To the south, across the narrow, churning ribbon of the Channel, was the meticulous, cold ambition of William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed the throne based on that single broken oath and a desperate need to seize control. William was not merely a warrior. He was an administrator of unparalleled cruelty and efficiency, and his preparations for invasion were legendary in their scope. London became the frantic staging ground, the beating heart pumping blood and soldiers out to meet the threats. First, the incredible dash north, Harold Godwinson, leaving the city in a whirlwind of dust and determination, marched his exhausted army hundreds of miles in a blinding sprint to Yorkshire, covering distances that should have taken weeks in mere days.
he met Hardrada at Stamford Bridge in a shocking, brutal victory that annihilated the last great Viking threat to England, securing the north forever, but draining every ounce of energy and resource from the Saxon fighting machine. The relief that swept through the anxious streets of London was immense, a collective exhale that the old menace had finally been vanquished.
The Saxon king now had to perform the impossible feat. Another forced march south, his troops weary, depleted, and utterly unprepared for the kind of cold, calculating military genius they were about to face. They staggered back toward the capital, knowing that if they paused, William would have time to march on London itself.
The fate of London, the fate of the entire Anglo-Saxon world, would not be decided by a siege or a treaty, but on a muddy, blood-soaked ridge far to the south, near a small hill known as Senlac. On October 14th, 1066, the shields clashed, the axes swung, and Harold Godwinson fell, pierced through the eye by an arrow, or perhaps hacked apart by relentless Norman cavalry. The details were irrelevant. The outcome was not. The Saxon shield wall shattered, the English army dissolved, and the last true Saxon king of England lay dead. The news traveled north like a plague wind. Panic seized London, which was suddenly leaderless, facing a victorious, ruthless army marching steadily toward the Thames. The surviving Witenagemote and the powerful local Londoners quickly crowned Edgar Atheling, a young, weak, and largely symbolic descendant of the old Saxon line, hoping this quick coronation would rally support and offer a legitimate resistance. It was a desperate, childish move against a truly professional conqueror who understood that power was seized, not inherited. William marched, not directly into the heavily defended gates of the city, which he correctly assessed would be too costly to assault, but around the city, systematically destroying the surrounding countryside, cutting off supply lines, and demonstrating the horrific consequences of continued resistance. He performed a masterful flanking maneuver that stunned the Saxon leadership. He crossed the Thames at Wallingford, trapping the city in a vice, proving that London's walls were only as strong as its stomach for starvation. The psychological warfare worked flawlessly. The Witenagemote realized the game was over. They saw the smoke rising from the burning fields and knew that starvation was a slower, more painful death than surrender. In a dramatic procession, the remaining Saxon leaders, including the newly crowned Edgar, the Archbishop Stigand, and the wealthiest citizens of London, walked out of the gates and knelt before William at Berkhamsted. They offered him the crown, formally submitting the beating heart of England to the Norman yoke. On Christmas Day, 1066, in Edward the Confessor's magnificent Westminster Abbey, the ritual was completed. William the Conqueror was crowned King of England. But this coronation was anything but peaceful or celebratory. When the Archbishop asked the English populace if they accepted William, their affirmative shouts were so loud that the Norman guards outside
misunderstanding the noise as a riot or an attack, panicked and instantly set fire to the surrounding wooden houses in a terrifying display of military trigger happiness. So, even at the moment of its complete subjugation, London was consumed by fire once again, a fiery symbol of the violence inherent in its new, brutal ruler. The city had survived the Vikings and the Saxons, only to fall to the cold efficiency of the Normans, a power shift that would reshape its stones, its laws, and its very identity forever. William had seized the spiritual and political center, but he knew control required more than oaths and ceremonies. He needed a physical manifestation of absolute, terrifying power that would loom over the Saxon populace forever, an unyielding monolith of foreign tyranny. His first, most monumental act was to commission the construction of a fortress on the eastern edge of the Roman wall, right where the Thames curled into the city and offered easy access for supplies and military control. This was not just a castle. It was a statement of permanent occupation. The Tower of London, a gigantic, stone-built behemoth, imported entirely alien architecture that mocked the simple wooden halls of the Saxons and terrified the citizens with its sheer scale and impregnability. It was built by forced labor, a permanent barracks for Norman soldiers, a treasury, and, most chillingly, a prison designed to hold anyone who dared challenge the new order. London was now under total surveillance, ruled not by agreement or tradition, but by the relentless, cold threat of the stone fortress. The story of London was about to enter its medieval phase, a phase defined by the iron fist of William and the towering, inescapable shadow he cast across the city he had so ruthlessly conquered. William the Conqueror did not simply demand obedience. He demanded a permanent, terrifying presence that would scorch the memory of Anglo-Saxon London forever. His greatest monument to this terror, the inescapable White Tower, began to scrape the sky above the city walls, a chilling, hulking promise to any Londoner who dared dream of resistance. This monstrous stone keep, a behemoth of cane stone shipped across the Channel, was not just a fortress. It was a psychological weapon, a colossal symbol designed to project Norman superiority and establish fear as the reigning law of the land. Every block placed was a nail hammered into the coffin of the old, free city. The Londoners, still inhabiting the footprint laid down by the Romans and surrounded by their own ancient wall, were forced to adapt to a new, ruthless language of law and order, defined by the rigid and often brutal feudal hierarchy, where land, loyalty, and wealth flowed strictly from the king's merciless command. While William was cunning enough to grant the city certain ancient privileges, recognizing that a wealthy, working city was essential for his coffers, these rights were now subject to the merciless oversight of Norman administration and its armed garrisons. The city breathed, but only at the king's highly calculated and demanding permission. Yet, Even under the iron fist of conquest, the single unyielding pulse of London remained its absolute devotion to money and trade. The medieval city quickly rediscovered its ancient, unstoppable purpose as the ultimate trading hub, the magnetic crossroads for every valuable commodity in the known Western world. This economic resurgence was not a matter of chance. It was organized, rigid, and ultimately ambitious, giving rise to power structures that would define London's soul for centuries, the great guilds. The mercers, the grocers, the drapers, the fishmongers. These were not mere trade associations. They were secret societies, power blocks, whose collective influence and wealth could rival and often surpass that of the great barons outside the city walls. They effectively seized control of the city's economy, setting prices, ensuring quality through often brutal inspections and enforcement, and acting as private armies of capital, protecting their monopolies with lethal determination. To be excluded from a powerful guild was to be economically dead, a beggar on the streets. To be a master was to hold the true, unofficial keys to the medieval metropolis, earning power that the king himself had to respect and often beg for. They transformed the muddy tracks of Cheapside, Eastcheap, and Lombard Street into a dazzling, chaotic, and terrifyingly rich marketplace, a destination for silks from Italy, furs from Russia, highly desired spices from the East, and, critically, wool, the very backbone of England's national wealth. As the wealth surged and the traffic intensified, London demanded permanence beyond the flimsy, often destroyed wooden crossings spanning the mighty Thames. In a move of staggering ambition, a project began that would forever change the skyline and the logistics of the city: the creation of London Bridge, a structure that would become a city in its own right, standing defiant against the powerful tidal currents. This immense structure, painstakingly built of stone and lined not just with a roadway, but with houses, shops, and even a chapel dedicated to St. Thomas, became one of the greatest engineering marvels of the entire medieval age. It was a vital artery, connecting the economic powerhouse of the North Bank with the essential farmlands and pilgrim routes of the South, a dense, crowded world suspended over the churning brown waters. But medieval London lived under a perpetual and terrifying death sentence. Its tightly packed timber-framed buildings, often clad with highly flammable wattle and daub walls and thatched with straw and reeds, were nothing more than a ticking, densely packed inferno waiting for a single, careless spark. The Great Fire of 1133, a forgotten apocalypse compared to later cataclysms, but utterly devastating in its time, a terrifying rehearsal for the far greater disasters that history had planned. And if the fire was the hammer of destruction, then disease was the silent, invisible assassin that stalked every winding alley and crowded marketplace. The sanitation of medieval London was nothing short of horrifying, a direct challenge to human survival. The Thames, the very source of life, water, and transport, was also the main sewer, a vast open river of human and animal filth and pestilence. The air was thick and heavy with the stench of tanneries, slaughterhouses, and human waste, creating a perfect, inescapable petri dish for epidemics. While the ultimate horror of the Black Death was still waiting in the wings, localized outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and other sicknesses were constant, relentless, and unforgiving, thinning the tightly packed population with chilling efficiency. Meanwhile, the political grip of the original Norman conquerors began to subtly shift, replaced by the chaotic, powerful drama of the Plantagenet kings, starting with Henry II. London quickly became the essential, high-stakes political chessboard where monarchs played their games of power, constantly reliant on the immense, necessary wealth of the city's merchant class. The demands of these kings, from Richard the Lionheart's ransom money to the infamous King John's endless financial needs to fund his losing wars and endless ego, were constant and merciless. This created an explosive, defining tension between the crown and the increasingly rich, highly organized, and now politically leveraged citizens who were forced to fund it all. The citizens of London, recognizing the absolute necessity of their gold to the functioning of the realm, began to demand formal recognition of their own power and their own rights, pressing for official charters and self-governance. This volatile pressure cooker of commerce, royal debt, and organizational power was slowly but surely forging a new, defiant identity for the city. London was no longer merely a royal possession to be exploited. It was becoming a relentless, self-aware political player, a force of organized money and influence that even the most tyrannical of kings could no longer ignore for long. The stage was set for the next catastrophic confrontation, the inevitable clash between the limitless demands of the crown and the burgeoning, self-interested rights of the world's greatest merchant city, a clash that would lead to war, rebellion, and eventually the forging of modern England itself. The conflict we left off with was no longer a negotiation, it was a ticking clock. The king, specifically the disastrously incompetent Henry III, saw London not as a partner in governance, but as an ATM waiting to be drained dry, a limitless source of gold for his increasingly insane continental ambitions and his lavish, ego-driven building projects. His obsession with continental wars and the construction of the glorious, impossibly expensive folly that was Westminster Abbey meant the city's coffers were never safe from royal seizure. Every time the royal writs arrived, demanding forced loans and aids, the Lord Mayor's blood pressure spiked, and the collective fury of the merchant class surged. The crown was treating the financial heart of the nation like a personal piggy bank, and the Londoners, proud holders of the liberties codified only decades earlier in the Magna Carta, were beginning to seethe with revolutionary fervor. They had secured those rights through great sacrifice. They would fight again to keep them, even if it meant raising the drawbridges against their own king. This simmering, dangerous resentment found its flashpoint in the radical, magnetic figure of Simon de Montfort, a French nobleman turned English revolutionary who tapped directly into the deep, powerful vein of London discontent. when de Montfort challenged Henry III's absolute, failing power. The great, formidable gates of London swung open wide to welcome the rebel army, offering sanctuary and strength. The city immediately became the engine room of the nascent parliamentary movement, offering men mountains of money and, most importantly, a political legitimacy that no other town in England could possibly provide. The dramatic, brutal Battle of Lewes in 1264 saw Londoners fighting fiercely, though perhaps less skillfully than the trained knights, cementing their role as crucial, bloodied players in national politics and governance. The king was effectively captive to the rebellious barons, and for a terrifying, exhilarating, and fleeting moment, London was the true political capital of a revolution demanding shared governance and an end to unchecked royal supremacy. The revolution ultimately failed. The barons were crushed, and de Montfort was killed and mutilated. But the dangerous genie of citizen power could not be put back in the bottle of tyranny. When Edward I, the formidable hammer of the Scots, took the throne, he understood both the immense danger the city posed and the absolute necessity of its cash reserves. He tried a different, more insidious tactic than his father: heavy-handed, calculated control designed to keep London perpetually off balance. Edward, I revoked the city's charter multiple times, essentially holding London's cherished self-governance hostage whenever he needed a huge, immediate war chest to fund his brutal, endless campaigns in Wales and Scotland. London learned a bitter, pragmatic lesson in medieval realpolitik. Sometimes, the greatest, most effective defense against tyranny was not rebellion, but powerful financial leverage. They would pay, yes, the taxes and the forced loans, but they would demand specific, crucial concessions in return, trading gold for specific freedoms that slowly but surely insulated their internal affairs from absolute royal control. Despite the relentless political chaos, the physical city was rapidly transforming into a dense, sprawling marvel of medieval engineering and commerce. Wooden structures were slowly but surely being replaced by stone and sturdy brick, driven both by practicality and the devastating collective memory of past catastrophic fires. Powerful guilds ruled the economy, turning trades like tailoring, weaving, and goldsmithing into dynastic, aristocratic power structures that governed daily life with iron fists and spectacular displays of wealth and feasting. Cheapside, the great roaring market thoroughfare, was no longer just a street. It was the intense, volatile, beating heart of European trade, where languages from Flanders to Genoa could be heard clamoring for goods, silver, and influence. But all this concentrated prosperity, all this aggressive political maneuvering, was building a population density ripe for the next inevitable catastrophe, one that no moat or city wall could stop. London was a functional tinderbox, teeming with life, and the flame this time was invisible, carried silently on the very air the citizens breathed. In 1348, the unthinkable, the truly biblical horror arrived, the Black Death. This was not a war, not a targeted fire set by man, but a plague so swift, so universally merciless, that it tore the intricate fabric of society wide open at the seams. The pestilence, carried by the fleas on the millions of rats that infested the docks and alleys, landed in the port districts and exploded through the densely packed streets and fetid, unsanitary alleyways with the speed of a wildfire. The statistics remain horrifying, almost physically unbelievable. London may have lost half its entire population in just 2 agonizing years. Yet, as always, London survived its own death. The sheer, terrifying scale of the tragedy created an immediate, cataclysmic economic revolution overnight. Labor became desperately scarce, and suddenly the common working man held economic power he had never dreamed of in feudal society. With half the workforce gone, lords, guilds, and masters could no longer enforce the old, miserable wage rates. Wages skyrocketed dramatically, and the surviving peasants and laborers suddenly demanded better lives, better food, and actual rights, not just the scraps they had always been given. The conservative, fearful government of the young, foolish Richard II tried desperately to halt this seismic social shift, passing the infamous Statute of Laborers to forcibly cap wages back at pre-plague medieval levels, a tyrannical move so profoundly unpopular and economically illiterate it was guaranteed to cause an explosion. The inevitable explosion came in 1381, the Peasants' Revolt. It was the ultimate, violent expression of the newly empowered post-plague English commoner. Led by the charismatic populist Wat Tyler and the radical, revolutionary preacher John Ball, tens of thousands of enraged peasants marched on London, determined to secure their economic freedom. They weren't just seeking better wages. They were seeking a fundamental, brutal change to the entire feudal system, crying out for an end to serfdom and poll taxes. When they arrived at the city's boundaries, the terrified Lord Mayor and aldermen, fearing the wrath of the surrounding countryside more than they feared the crown's soldiers, ordered the gates blown open, sealing their own fate. This was an invasion unlike any London had ever endured, not by foreign armies seeking conquest, but by its own desperate citizens, fueled by years of systemic oppression, and now by the sudden, fierce realization of their own collective power. They poured into the streets, seeking out the objects of their hatred, the lawyers, the tax collectors, and the hated financiers who held the debt of the realm. The floodgates of history had burst open. When the massive, terrified mob, numbering tens of thousands, reached the ancient walls of London, there was no defense, only surrender. Mayor Walworth, usually a stone-cold pillar of authority, was rendered utterly impotent by the sheer scale of the terror pouring down the roads from Kent and Essex. The true crisis was not the fighting, but the terrifying complicity of the poor within the city itself, who opened the gates of Aldgate and London Bridge without a single drop of blood being shed by the attackers. The invaders were not seeking mere loot. They were seeking justice, twisted and dark as it was. Their first target, the colossal, glittering monument to aristocratic arrogance, the Savoy Palace. This was the home of John of Gaunt, the most hated man in England, the de facto ruler and the symbol of all the taxes, all the wars, and all the crushing debt that had driven them to madness. The destruction was meticulously planned and terrifyingly effective. They didn't just burn it, they systematically dismantled it, refusing to steal any of the fabulous wealth within. Silver and gold plate, priceless jewels, tapestries woven with threads of pure silk, all were smashed, pulverized, or thrown into the Thames, lest any man be accused of self-enrichment by the revolution. It was a cleansing fire, a rejection of wealth itself.
The rebels then turned their attention to the temple, the ancient heart of England's legal system, the complex of buildings where every oppressive statute, every crushing fine, and every document of serfdom was stored. They burned the temple to the ground, watching the paper records of their servitude turn to ash on the wind, believing they were literally burning away the evidence of their misery. But the greatest prize remained locked behind the impenetrable stone walls of the greatest fortress in the realm, the Tower of London. Within its inner sanctum, the boy King Richard II huddled with his most crucial ministers, surrounded by an elite garrison of hardened knights. Outside, beneath the ominous shadow of the White Tower, an ocean of enraged armed peasants screamed for blood, demanding the surrender of the hated Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, and the king's treasurer, Robert Hales.
For 2 days, the tower was besieged, its defenders paralyzed by fear and indecision, knowing that if they fired a single arrow, the entire city would turn against them. The royal court was trapped, watching helplessly as London burned around them, the smoke thick enough to choke the breath out of the monarchy itself. Richard, barely 14, saw the situation was untenable. He made a move of terrifying, almost suicidal courage. He agreed to meet the rebels. On June 14, 1381, Richard rode out to Mile End, a massive, muddy field outside the city walls, where he promised the rebels everything they asked for: charters of freedom, the abolition of serfdom, and general amnesty. The rebels, elated and believing their demands met, dispersed some of their numbers. But the radical core, the most dangerous element, led by the charismatic Wat Tyler, remained. They wanted more than promises. They wanted heads. While Richard was out making impossible promises, the most catastrophic failure of security in the tower's history occurred. The remaining rebels, perhaps 400 strong, simply walked through the outer gates, which had been left undefended, or perhaps deliberately opened by disaffected guards. They stormed the inner fortress, not facing a single serious resistance. It was a desperate bluff, a magnificent lie. He led the bewildered mob away from the city gates, holding them captive by his sheer youthful magnetism and the promise of continued reform. While he distracted them, Mayor Walworth quickly raised the royal banner and summoned reinforcements from the surrounding shires, loyal knights who had been waiting for the signal to strike. Though serfdom was not immediately abolished by law, the fear of another uprising meant that landlords found it nearly impossible to enforce the old labor dues. The tide had turned irreversibly towards paid labor and tenant farming, accelerating the economic forces that would eventually define London's burgeoning commercial power. The city recovered with astonishing speed, its merchant guilds cementing their authority, even as the great noble families retreated to lick their wounds.
London learned a terrifying lesson. Its prosperity was always one riot, one famine, or one charismatic demagogue away from utter destruction. The city responded not by becoming softer, but by hardening its political structure, consolidating power within the hands of the wealthy, protective livery companies, ensuring that such a breach of its walls would never happen again. The stain of the revolt was deep, but London, as always, absorbed the trauma and used it as fuel. It moved on, shaking off the blood and ashes of 1381, preparing for the next equally devastating cycle of plague, war, and political betrayal that lay just over the horizon, always ready for the next death and the next defiant resurrection.